You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie in America.
And I'm Johanna in Austria, and you're listening to Fresh Hell, your favorite international podcast. Welcome back to our annual Spooky Fuckery month, special in a way. Before we get back into the ghosts of Jeopardy, quick reminder to send in your Halloween listener story until 20th of October, so you have 10 more days to go. Our email is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com, and you'll be automatically in the pool to win a giveaway, including Austrian sweets. And don't forget to let us know how we should call you in the episode. Thank you so much.
If you were here last week, then you already know that this year, for Spooky Fuckery Month, we are taking a deeper dive into the answers of a Jeopardy Tournament of Champions episode. More specifically, the ghosts category. Last week, we discussed Abigail Adams as a laundry ghost in the White House and some of the hauntings at the iconic, historic Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel.
This week, we're back to America's East Coast with the third question of 5 on the board, which asked, quote, Dylan Thomas's ghost reportedly still hangs out at this fabled NYC hotel on 23rd Street, his last residence, end quote. Annie?
What is the Hotel Chelsea? Not the Chelsea Hotel. That's tacky.
I didn't know that.
Apparently, Hotel Chelsea. Fine. Chelsea Hotel?
Because I've seen referred to as both.
Yes, because most people just call it the Chelsea Hotel. But no, they're the Hotel Chelsea.
Now we know better. Well, I know better. Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah. I saw something and somebody was like, what was it? You don't call it the Hotel Plaza. It's the Plaza. Something like, it was some silly thing, but it was just like, yeah, I don't understand the rules of the upper class.
I think that Chelsea has its own rules.
Yeah, for sure.
In an article entitled A History of Cooperative Housing in New York City from the Gilded Age to the Present, Darcy Gerstein writes, quote, New York City in the Gilded Age was in some ways an even more extreme version of socioeconomic divide than it is today. At the time, there were essentially two forms of housing. Private homes for the wealthy, which were often extravagant mansions of vast proportions, and tenements for the lower classes, which were often cramped, cold, dark, and dilapidated. It was in this era that the cooperative housing model came to the Big Apple. Partners Philip Hubert and Gerard Flagg built the Rembrandt at 152 West and 57th Street as the first apartment building under cooperative ownership in 1881, inspired by the success of what was known as the French flat apartments that were 4 times larger than the average tenement and included amenities like steam heat, light and air, and privacy, making them palatable to the middle class. They marketed the units to people of means and good social standing, and established artists, hence the name, who themselves financed the development they would eventually call home. In Hubert's next co-op endeavor, the Chelsea Hotel, there we have it, completed in 1885, he brought the idea of hotel amenities to apartment living. Full maintenance staff, dining options, concierge, and so on. His co-ops also brought the idea of exclusivity. The buildings were controlled by the owners themselves via the co-op board, who could set their own rules and chose who could live there. End quote. So these apartments were large, luxuriously appointed, and so much more affordable than the single-family homes with a yard they'd grown up in. Think Marvelous Miss Maisel or Sex and the City when we talk co-ops, and not the apartment in Friends, for example. Especially, I think, Chandler and Joey's apartment.
Right. Yeah. No, these are spacious, nice.
Yeah.
Like, gorgeous, large.
Although when it was first built, not every unit had a kitchen, but they all had private bathrooms, which was big at the time, I think. The co-op was 12 stories high. It was, for a very short time, the tallest building in New York City, unlike the Empire State Building, which we told you had a number of absolutely beautiful buildings torn down before it was built.
Oh, yeah.
The Chelsea was built in a vacant lot where a furniture showroom had burned down. The top floor had 2-story loft spaces reserved for artists, and some of the units had been reserved for the craftspeople working on the building, who took payment in this kind of way. which I find so interesting.
Yeah.
The Chelsea was built to be virtually fireproof with thick brick walls, along with iron and plaster with as little wood as possible. The co-op became the Hotel Chelsea in 1905 when the co-op was struggling financially and became a hotel by breaking up many of the very large apartments to create more one-of-a-kind rooms for guests. So when it opened in 1884, it was state-of-the-art and cutting-edge with both gas and electric lighting, steam heat, and the incredible luxury of hot and cold running water inside of your units. I also think that was big.
Oh, yeah.
We mentioned some units had no kitchen, and these were especially attractive to single professionals, and there was a kitchen in the massive basement and also a restaurant on the ground floor. There were several dumb waiters to deliver food to units with no kitchens, or anyone who wanted to order in. Not everybody wanted to cook all the time. There were also some basic shops and a barber in the building as well, with staff living in the building behind the Chelsea, which was connected with a tunnel. It was considered a very respectable place to live or to visit, and a lot of living has been done there, but also a lot of dying has been done there, and that's why we're here today.
That's right. And it's not all nefarious. In fact, like every other old hotel or residential building that we've talked about, it's mostly people passing of natural causes in their sleep from pneumonia, from the flu, or a heart condition. But this hotel, which had been built with artists in mind, had become, over the years, a real hotspot for artistic souls, many of them tortured. Those very thick brick walls made the spaces virtually soundproof, which musicians loved, and the visual artists appreciated the thought given to the light that entered the rooms. And the writers, of course, just loved the vibe of all the creative types there. The hotel was infamous for accepting art in lieu of cash payment, with plenty of masterpieces on the walls. If hauntings are caused by energy, then I think it's understandable that someplace like this huge, sexy, scary building would be a hotspot. So let's get into some of the more noted and upsetting deaths and other traumatic happenings over there on West 23rd Street, because there are a lot to get through, and we're going to go chronologically. And I'll warn you now, this is where there's too many warnings, to be honest, so here we go. The terrible things that have happened at the Chelsea. February 1908. The body of Elmira Wilcox was found in her room at the Hotel Chelsea. She appeared to be in her late 30s, and her suitcases marked a recent trip to Europe. Her cause of death was an overdose of narcotics, but the manner of death was under some speculation. Initially, reports indicated a suspected suicide. The papers report that she was a milliner, which means she made hats. She owned a hat shop in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She had previously set up businesses in Orange, Massachusetts, and Rutland, Vermont, which I found really interesting because that is where my grandmother on my dad's side family are all from, both Rutland, Vermont, and Orange, Mass. So I wonder if they had any of her hats. But yeah, she was traveling east from Milwaukee to visit family in Vermont, and on the way, she decided to stop in the city to do some shopping along the journey, and she stayed at the Chelsea Hotel. When they found her body in her room, they found a large number of very potent medications and 2 letters. One of the letters was addressed to her nephew, saying she was looking forward to seeing him at the end of the week, and was signed by Auntie. The other seemed to be to a lover. We don't really know. It was just addressed Dear Heart and mentions her many sleepless nights, but it was not addressed, so we don't know who exactly that was meant to be for. Initially, it was declared a probable suicide, but then her brother, a doctor, made a statement that she had been struggling with terrible insomnia, and when she stopped in New York, she also then got sick, so she had some kind of cold or flu situation on top of these 4 sleepless nights that she had suffered. And he believed she had died of an accidental combination of a potent mix of prescribed medication. We can't know for sure if her death was intentional or accidental, but either way, it was very sad and untimely, and it's a sad reminder to just be so careful with all of your prescription medications. But especially at that time. I mean, doctors were just handing out really heavy stuff.
Yeah, also always make sure to tell your doctors exactly what you take so they know if there's any kind of problems with other medications you take, because that can get really dangerous as well.
Absolutely.
The next is from 1909, and this is an article we found in the New York Times from 26th of October 1909 on page 6. Quote, because he had been robbed of $1,200 of the funds of an Hungarian benevolent society of which he was treasurer, Frank Kawecki, a Hungarian, committed suicide by shooting himself in the head yesterday at the Chelsea Hotel. Kawecki left letters to his wife and friends and to the coroner stating that he was robbed of the money in the subway when someone cut his pocket, that he could not replace it, and that as he feared he would be charged with having stolen the money, which represented the savings of many Hungarians all over the United States. He chose to kill himself. For 40 years, Kawecki lived in the Bronx, where he had an excellent character. He was a painter and decorator and made a comfortable living for himself and his wife, Julia. The couple had no children. Kawecki several years ago was elected treasurer of the Hungarian Sick and Benevolent Society, which has 24 branches scattered all over the United States. The president of the society is Frank Szabo and the secretary is Julius Knossi. It was Kawecki's duty to collect the dues from the members of the society every 3 months and turn the money over to the secretary. His latest collection was due on Sunday. Taking the books of the organization with him and kissing his wife goodbye, he left home Sunday afternoon, saying that he was going to call on Secretary Knossi. That was the last his wife saw of him alive. Instead of going to Brooklyn, Kawecki got off on 23rd Street and went over to the Chelsea Hotel. There, he registered under his own name, but he put his residence down as East River, Connecticut. He was assigned to one of the best rooms in the hotel and apparently set about immediately to end his life. He wrote a letter to his wife, one to his friend, and one simply addressed "to whom it may concern." In each letter, Kawecki gave his reasons for suicide. He stated in each letter that he had always been an honest man and he could not stand the disgrace of being charged with having stolen the money. After writing the letters, Kawecki apparently sat down in a rocking chair and shot himself through the right temple with a .44 caliber bulldog revolver. No one heard the shot and the hotel manager did not know of it when his friend called about 10 o'clock yesterday morning. "I've just received word from Mr. Kawecki that he intended to kill himself," he told the clerk, and an investigation was made. The door of Kawecki's room being locked, a bellboy climbed through the transom. Kawecki was found in the rocking chair dead with the revolver in his right hand. A physician in the hotel said that the man had been dead several hours. When Kawecki did not appear at Secretary Knossi's home in Brooklyn, the latter started an investigation which led him to the Chelsea just as Fisher was leaving. The body was taken charge of by President Szabo and the secretary and a number of Kawecki's friends, all of whom spoke in high praise of the dead man. "He was the soul of honor," said President Szabo, "and if he had told us of the robbery, his word would have been sufficient. During all the years he had been treasurer of the society, not a penny had gone wrong. He was a very sensitive man, however, and I suppose he feared that some of us wouldn't believe him. He never drank and was always a hard-working man." End quote. It's very sad.
So sad. So sad. And senseless.
Yeah.
And I bet the person who robbed him never thought that that would be...
Yeah.
Ugh.
It's a lot of money for back in the day.
Yeah.
$1,200 in 1909.
Yeah, a lot of money. All right. It's not going to get any happier, folks. April 1912. After a harrowing, deeply traumatic experience, some of the survivors and family stayed for weeks at the Chelsea, once arriving in New York after the Titanic disaster. The Chelsea is not as known as the Jane Hotel, which hosted a lot of survivors and had sort of a memorial, but many survivors and victims' loved ones did stay at the Chelsea.
I didn't know that one. That was new to me.
Same. All right, this next one is, this is bad. In March 1922, Etelka Graf and her daughter Cora, who was around 12, were staying at the hotel and had been there for a few weeks while visiting her parents, who I believe were silk merchants. One morning, early in the morning, it was like 7 a.m., Etelka took a small to medium pair of sewing scissors and methodically cut off her own left hand, flung it under the bed, and then leapt from the window of their 5th floor room.
Can you even imagine how much, I don't want to sound kind of flippant, but how much dedication it takes to cut off your own hand with a medium-sized
sewing scissors?
Pair of scissors?
Yeah, some of the reports I read said that the doctors were amazed that she was actually able to do it, because it would have been so painful. Yeah. So she leaps from the window. Meanwhile, her daughter faints at the sight of all of this, that poor child. But she doesn't die. She lands on a third-floor balcony, and she lands breaking both ankles, one of her arms, and her face and head are terribly cut up. But she's alive. Another feature that the hotel had when it first opened, which I neglected to mention, was when it first opened, it had every apartment had a telephone that called down to the manager's office. So at that time, that is really pretty cutting edge. Even when this happened, right? This is still pretty amazing, early 1900s, just to have a telephone. So when this happens, people immediately make emergency phone calls. And there's a police officer really close by. He runs up and he is able to stop the bleeding from her wrist and helps get her to Bellevue Hospital, where she was expected to make a recovery. We found an article in the Paducah Sun, Tuesday, March 7th, 1922, page 1, which says, Mrs. Graff said to have a chance, quote, Louisville, Kentucky, Miss Atelka Graff, who leapt from a window of her fifth-floor apartment in a New York hotel Sunday after cutting her wrists with a pair of scissors, has a slight chance to recover, according to information received here today. She is the wife of Theodore Graff of Louisville, who left for New York yesterday. Mrs. Graff had gone to New York about 3 weeks ago with her daughter to visit her father, a silk merchant. The child fainted as Mrs. Graff leapt from the window and landed on a third-floor balcony. Ill health is believed to have been her motive. End quote. Ill health.
Ill health, and she cut her wrist. I mean, they don't even dare to say what she really did.
No. Yeah.
Next up, we have the 1953 death of Dylan Thomas, who was living at the Chelsea when he drank his fatal 18 whiskeys at the nearby White Horse Tavern. But it looks as though we have another case of bad medical care taking someone too soon. Born on 27th of October 1914 in Swansea, South Wales, to a literature professor father who instilled an early love of poetry, Dylan Thomas had problematic lungs and a love for Edgar Allan Poe, as many do. He left school at 16 to work for the local paper and churn out poetry in the way only a moody teenager can, but his stuff was actually very good, and more than half of his life's poems were written at this time of his life. At the tender age of 20, so in 1934, he moved to London, published his first book, and won the Poets' Corner Prize. He had also had a long-standing love of the theatre, especially for acting, writing, producing, and set painting. He met and married Irish writer and dancer Caitlin McNamara, and theirs would be a very tempestuous relationship. He just sent a telegram to his family to say he'd been married in Penzance, Cornwall. Dylan had served as an anti-aircraft gunner in the war and wrote scripts for propaganda films for the Ministry of Information, but his chronic lung issues prevented him taking any more active a role in the war. He then worked for the BBC as a scriptwriter, and he also narrated and helped with over 100 broadcasts. He kept writing, and his writing awarded him travel scholarships. Caitlin didn't like it when he traveled without her, and for good reasons, since he wasn't very faithful. They both drank too much, and in 1950 he visited the USA for the first time at the age of 35. Thomas was a very theatrical man, and his readings helped to bring the idea of poetry reading as a new art to the US. As for his death, he did 4 of these tours in the US, and he arrived in New York City on 20th of October 1953 to begin his 4th tour.
We should probably mention that if you don't know who Dylan Thomas is, he is probably best known for, his poetry is amazing, but he is the one who is probably most famous for Do Not Go Gently Into That Good Night, yeah. Rage, rage against the dying of the light, that poem, that's him. So that's who we're talking about here.
His agent assigned a woman named Liz to assist him, and Liz was shocked at how ill he seemed when she picked him up from the airport. She then took him to the Chelsea to check into his room, and after rehearsal, they went to the White Horse Tavern for drinks before returning to the Chelsea. The next day, she asked if he'd like to do anything, but he said he felt ill and wanted to stay in bed all day. Liz came to the hotel and gave him half a grain of phenobarbital to help him rest, and spent the night to help watch over him. 2 days later was the third rehearsal, and Dylan said he was too sick to rehearse, but did his best, shivering and burning up with fever before passing out on stage. The next day, Liz takes him to her doctor, who gives him some steroid shots which allow him to power through the first performance, but to collapse when it was done. He had lost his voice by the 25th, and fellow actors described him as desperately ill. 27th of October, so his 39th birthday, he attends a party thrown for him, but leaves after an hour to go back to the hotel to rest. And we should mention that during this time there were unprecedented deaths due to how terrible the smog was in the city, which certainly would not have helped matters because, remember, he had lung problems already. On 3rd of November, after having friends visit during the day, he went out to meet people for drinks twice, then went back to the hotel only to head out for another round at 2 a.m. And when he returned to the Chelsea, he now infamously declared, quote, "I've had 18 straight whiskeys. I think that's the record," end quote. This is a now infamous quote, and many people believe the reason for his death. But the thing is, in reality, some did the math and worked out that the most he could have had in that time was 9, with 8 actually being even more likely, which, don't get me wrong, it's still too many, but not so much that you would die the next day.
Yeah.
The next day, he was supposed to meet someone but called to cancel because he felt so awful, and those who spoke to him that day say he sounded as awful as he felt. He tried to go out for a drink at the White Horse that night but felt crummy, and he went back to his bed at the Chelsea. Dr. Feltenstein saw him thrice that day, administering shots of cortisone at the first 2 visits, except for the final visit of the day when he injected him with morphine. He used too much morphine, and apparently, if you were a good doctor, even at the time, you knew not to use too much morphine on someone with breathing problems. But the doctor hadn't examined him and didn't know that he had a chronic lung issue and asthma. Liz was there with him, and she was getting more and more worried about his slow breathing and calls Dr. Feltenstein, who suggests that what she really needs to do is to get a man to help her.
He's like, "You're a hysterical woman. How about if you get a man to just be there so you stop calling me so much?"
It's always good to call a man in this kind of situations. Any man will do.
The audacity.
So she calls the painter Jack Hallicker, who arrives around 11 p.m. And even the man can see that there's a real problem, even though it's not a doctor, he's a painter. Because shortly after his arrival, Dylan Thomas had become blue. That's never a good sign.
And he's a painter, so he recognizes blue.
Various shades of blue, even.
It's like, please, I know you don't believe the woman, but I'm here. I'm a man, and I am telling you, it's not good.
I mean, it's good. Now she has a man at her side, and so Liz once again calls for the doctor, who this time comes out again, because now there's a man who says, yeah, there's a problem.
Yeah.
He takes one look at Dylan Thomas, and he phones for an ambulance immediately, which then took an hour to arrive, even though it was only a few blocks to the hospital.
Yeah, ambulances in New York City are super stressful for me. Like, anytime there's gridlock in an ambulance, it stresses me out, even when I have no idea who's in it.
So a comatose Dylan Thomas was finally admitted to St. Vincent's Hospital at 1:58 a.m. He scared and was completely taken over by Feltenstein, who didn't have admitting rights for the St. Vincent's. And he didn't even call the hospital's brain specialist until 36 hours after his admission. Dylan Thomas died at noon on 9th of November, having never regained consciousness. After his death, there was immediate rumor and speculation that he had drank himself to death, and I think that's what most people believe.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, it's not as though it's impossible for the 39-year-old to drink themselves to death. And we all know Dylan Thomas liked to drink. And people can die of alcohol poisoning. The problem is that it seems Thomas was a victim of a terrible doctor, just like in the Garfield case we just started a couple of weeks ago. Long story long, and there are a lot of books out there about this, and articles, and we'll link to all of them or the ones we used in our sources. But basically, the current belief is that he had a terrible case of pneumonia, and rather than correctly diagnosing him with what was clearly a chest infection, he was misdiagnosed by Feltenstein as having delirium tremens, so the shakes from alcohol withdrawal. He never considered his patient might actually be sick when he injected him with morphine, starving his brain of oxygen, causing coma and death. It seems one bad doctor simply heard of his dramatic statement that he had 18 whiskeys to drink, believed it, and treated him without ever giving a proper examination. That's very tragic. And I remember in English class when I was in high school, we read Don't Go Gentle.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time in the 1990s, it was still considered that he drank himself to death. I remember
right.
that. That's what we learned.
Absolutely. I think that is the most common belief, is that he drank himself to death. And don't get me wrong, it was for sure a contributing factor, right? Alcoholism is never going to improve other health conditions, but no, he was killed by that doctor. Next, we have September 1968. Charles Jackson, best-selling author of The Lost Weekend, overdosed while living at the Chelsea Hotel. So let's talk about him. Biography info was primarily from Dartmouth College records and also a 2013 article in the New York Times by Donna Rifkin called The Lost Novelist, which, of course, we will link to. Charles Reginald Jackson didn't have a very easy life. He was born in Summit, New Jersey on April 6, 1903, and had 2 older and 2 younger siblings. In 1916, his only sister and youngest brother were killed in a horrifying car accident, and his father abandoned the family. After graduating from high school in 1921, he went to work for the Newark Courier as their editor and main copywriter. He had attended 1 year of university, but he was the victim of a really cruel, awful fraternity prank, which made him look like he'd made unwanted advances toward another young man. Basically, another guy in the fraternity pretended to have a crush on Charles and made Charles believe that he had feelings for him. And then when Charles said that yes, he actually was interested in getting to know this young man, he turned it around and said that Charles had hit on him and he was gay and he was, all the homophobic awfulness you can imagine, right? And so he left school and returned home to write, which breaks my heart. And let's not pretend that this kind of stuff doesn't still happen today. To all kinds of people. It's just not nice. So, by all accounts, Charles was very sensitive and very kind. He really liked people, and people really liked him. Rifkind writes, quote, Jackson would later blame his mother for both his alcoholism and his homosexuality. In turn, she was quick to criticize the stories he wrote about his hometown, complaining, quote, I don't see anything so wonderful about it. It all happened. All you had to do was write it down. End quote.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah. Not the most supportive. No. He lived in Chicago, where he worked at a bookstore, and then he moved to New York City for a job with Doubleday Bookstores. Along with the new job, the move to the city also gave Charles tuberculosis. His surviving younger brother, Frederick, who he'd always been close to, also had the disease, and they spent a lot of time in sanatoriums together. To quote Dartmouth, I don't know why I liked this, quote, they spent the years 1929 to 1931 in Davos, Switzerland, and although Jackson was cured, he was left with a drinking habit and only 1 lung, end quote. Returning to New York City during the worst years of the Great Depression, he couldn't, of course, find work, and he wasn't able to get any new work published, and none of that helped his mental health. He drank more and more, finally becoming his own model for Don Burnham of The Lost Weekend. In 1938, he married Rhoda Booth, a researcher for Fortune, who, along with Frederick, had helped him recover from his drinking habit. The publication of The Lost Weekend in January 1944 brought Jackson instant fame and fortune. This is what Amazon says about the book, quote, the classic tale of one man's struggle with alcoholism, this revolutionary novel remains Charles Jackson's best-known book, a daring autobiographical work that paved the way for contemporary addiction literature. It is 1936, and on the east side of Manhattan, a would-be writer named Don Burnham decides to have a drink, and then another, until he's in the midst of what becomes a 5-day binge. The Lost Weekend moves with unstoppable speed, propelled by a heartbreaking but unflinching truth. It catapulted Charles Jackson to fame and endures as an acute story of the ravages of alcoholism, as well as an unforgettable parable of the condition of the modern man. End quote.
So the book then became a film, The Lost Weekend, that came out in 1945 and was directed by Billy Wilder, which is interesting because most just know Billy Wilder from his comedies, but no. And it was starring Ray Milland and Jane Wyman, who most people know from Falcon Crest as Angela or the wife of former US President Ronald Reagan. So that's all. Fun facts. The film was nominated for 7 Academy Awards and won 4 of them for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Adapted Screenplay, and it's one of my top 10 movies of all time. It's fantastic. Fun fact, because it also shared the Grand Prix at the very first Cannes Film Festival, it's now one of only 3 films in the history to win both the Best Picture Oscar and the highest award at Cannes. The other 2 were 1955's Marty and 2019's Korean movie Parasite.
I have only seen Parasite. I've never seen The Lost Weekend or read it.
You have to watch it. It's so good.
Okay. I'm just remembering something I read. You might have already known this, but if not, I might have a fun fact for you. There's an effect in the film The Lost Weekend where the main character is like walking and then the scene around him kind of sped up to show the change of seasons. Mm-hmm. And that's the first time that was ever done on film. And now it's an effect that's used all the time. But the first time that was done, I always think of Notting Hill with the seasons changing. But
oh, yeah, true, yeah.
The first time that was ever done was in that film. So Charles Jackson has huge financial success. And with this, he buys 6 Chimney Farm in New Hampshire. And that's where he lived with his wife and 2 young children. They spent 10 years there. But in 1950, Charles relapsed. He sold the beloved family home in New Hampshire to pay off creditors, and things really deteriorated in his marriage, in large part because of his sobriety as well as other issues. And he eventually left the family in 1965, and he was living at the Chelsea Hotel at that point with a male lover or partner. I don't actually know the extent of the relationship, but he was in a relationship with a man at that point. I don't mean to diminish whoever that was' relationship. A couple of things to note that are sort of interesting. So, his mother, that quote I read to you about his mother saying, I don't see what the big deal is. Things just happened to you and you wrote about them. And that does seem to be the truth. And a lot of what he wrote, there was a real grain of truth in all of it. And of course, what made him special is the way that he captured the ordinary, right? And explained it for other people. One sad thing to mention is his first published work was a short story about being abused in church as a child, I believe along with his brother. And so there's a real reason to believe that abuse did happen. The other interesting thing to note is that his second book, The Fall of Valor, is considered a gay literature classic, right? It is roughly about a married man who falls in love with, I believe, a young soldier. It's a wartime thing. And that probably is also, at least in part, autobiographical. Today, he's considered bisexual, as I said, he was living with a man at the time of his death. And as for his death, Charles Jackson overdosed on barbiturates on September 17th, 1968, and he died 3 days later in the hospital on the 21st. His death was ruled a suicide by the medical examiner, who at that time was Dr. Bodden, who I think a lot of us are familiar with. He hosted the HBO Autopsy show, and if you're into true crime at all, you probably know who Dr. Michael Bodden is. Charles Jackson's legacy lives on in the recorded speeches that he gave to Alcoholics Anonymous. He was a huge participant and believer in Alcoholics Anonymous and was one of the first members in the group to speak publicly about also being addicted to sleeping pills and other barbiturates. He is the reason that people started to sort of talk about this at that time and how addictions were more than just alcohol. You can still listen to his speeches on YouTube, and they are still a source of inspiration for many people.
Next up is an incident that happened just a little bit over a year after his death. That happened in November 1969. Stephen A. Brent. He was a very close friend of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, and he died by suicide at the hotel. He'd been absolutely devastated and horrified by what had happened to his dear friend Sharon Tate and her unborn baby, and of course all the other victims of the Manson family just a few months prior. And he was struggling with his own substance issues and a failed suicide attempt just a month before. He had gone to see the Rolling Stones concert at Madison Square Garden with Ultraviolet, muse and artist who had once been close to Dali, Salvador Dali, and who she studied with before meeting Andy Warhol and becoming one of his famous girls, the factory girls, I think they were called, or the Chelsea girls?
Factory, girls. Yeah, the Chelsea, both factory girls and the Chelsea girls, yeah.
And Steve Maybe Brand, he hadn't been himself that night, and he left the Stones concert early. Ultraviolet was worried about him, so she called on him to check up if he's all right. So she called him at the Chelsea to check up on him. And he answered the phone and he told her he had overdosed. And she immediately called for help, but it was too late.
So again, so young and just so tragic. He was just so broken.
So much trauma in so many lives.
This is it. You don't realize, we talked about it with the man who shot himself, but how these crimes ripple, the ripple effect that you see, All right, now it's time for the one story involving the Chelsea that most people have probably heard of. And that is, of course, the tragic murder of Nancy Spungen, possibly by her boyfriend, Sid Vicious, bassist of the punk rock band The Sex Pistols. God save the Queen. All right. First of all, we need to tell you about a super spooky coincidence.
So weird.
It's really weird, right? So we realized that Sid Vicious was born on May 10th, 1957, 20 years before me on my birthday. And Nancy Spungen was born on February 27th, 1958, which is Johanna's birthday. Sid Vicious has my birthday and Nancy Spungen has Johanna's birthday.
Yeah. What does it mean? It has to mean something.
It has to mean something.
That's how the universe works, right?
I don't know. I think it's spooky. All right. So let's get into this story. Let's first talk about Sid Vicious, or should I say John Simon Ritchie, because that's his real name. Sid Vicious was never really about the music, at least not in the traditional sense. When he joined the Sex Pistols in 1977, replacing bassist Glenn Matlock, it wasn't his bass playing skills that got him the gig. But that didn't matter in punk. Punk wasn't about being good. Punk was about being loud, raw, and unapologetically defiant. And Sid definitely embodied that. Sid was a punk poster child for self-destruction. His stage presence was electric. His actual contribution to the music? Not so much. But he wasn't hired for his talent. He was hired for his attitude, and he was the attitude. He was the wild-eyed, sneering middle finger to the establishment, and the Sex Pistols became famous in 1976, shortly after their formation in 1975 in London. Their breakthrough came with their first single, Anarchy in the UK, which was released in November of 1976. Their rebellious lyrics and aggressive sound quickly established them as leaders of the emerging punk rock movement. And the Sex Pistols' fame was also fueled by controversy. In December 1976, they made a now infamous appearance on the British TV show Today with Bill Grundy, where they swore and insulted the host.
Unheard of in the 70s on TV.
Yeah.
Like shocking, especially in the UK.
Yeah. Shocking. And this really made headlines everywhere and propelled the band into the spotlight. In 1977, Sid met a young woman named Nancy Spungen. She was born, as we said, on Johanna's birthday, February 27, but in 1958. She was born in Philadelphia, and almost from day one, her life was anything but ordinary. When she was born, her umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck a few times, which gave her parents quite a scare. And they noticed right away that she wasn't really like other babies or other children. She was prone to violent tantrums and uncontrollable outbursts, even as a toddler. By the time she was 2, doctors were already pointing to emotional disturbances. At 15, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, although some later questioned that diagnosis. Nancy was rebellious, unpredictable, and by her teenage years, she had turned to drugs. Heroin, in particular, became her crutch, and that addiction only deepened when she moved to New York in the mid-70s.
Yeah, we often see it. People who have mental health issues turn to drugs to self-medicate. And still, today, so many people look at it and they're like, oh my God, these people just want to get high to party. And that's very rarely the case, especially with drugs like heroin. It's like a very small number of people take hard drugs, and especially heroin, because they want to party. There's always some form of self-medication going on.
Yeah, and we're really only just now starting to look at why people develop these addiction issues, right? So Nancy really found her way into the punk scene and became a notorious groupie. She also worked as a sex worker, which she was very open about. She also followed bands like Aerosmith and the Ramones.
And I just really want to stress the point that she was 17 at the time. And I think it's already starting. There's a whole conversation we could have about 70s rock bands and their underage groupies. And just because you mentioned Aerosmith, many people don't know that story. Steven Tyler, the lead singer of Aerosmith, he did obtain guardianship of an underage girl. Her name was Julia Holcomb in the 1970s. And Julia was 16 at the time. And Steven Tyler was 25. And according to Julia, who has spoken about the relationship a lot in later years, she was obviously in a very vulnerable position when she met Steven Tyler. And after Tyler convinced her parents to grant him guardianship, she lived with him and traveled on tour with the band. I think it was so that he could cross state lines with her.
That's
because
right.
She was underage.
Yeah, he couldn't just take his young girlfriend around because she was a teenager. So the only way to make it work was to basically adopt her. Ugh.
And their relationship ended after a series of traumatic events, including a fire in their apartment and a very horrible story of her pregnancy and some abort. He was horrible to her.
Horrible. Yeah, you told that much more graciously than I would have. Let's just put it that way. You can look into more information on that story. Unbelievably horrible. The other thing I keep thinking, for an episode, when we were doing some of the other stuff, I was like, you should do an episode on some of the old Hollywood traumas.
Oh, I have a lot to talk about there. A lot.
Right? I think that would be a fascinating couple of episodes. You know, that could even be like my 27 Club, where we're just dipping back in for a story of terrible Hollywood.
Yeah.
All
oh
right.
My God, yeah. I have a lot of stories.
I know, and I want to hear more of them. So, yeah, eventually Nancy Spungen left for London, where she would meet Sid Vicious, and their destructive romance would begin. Nancy wasn't just Sid's girlfriend, she was his drug buddy. I think, is she the one who really introduced him to hard drugs, I think
she introduced him to heroin. I'm not sure. I think, if I remember correctly.
I think I saw something with Johnny Rotten, some interview where he was basically saying he felt like Sid's death was his fault because he introduced him to Nancy. Something like that. But they were very toxic. They were codependent and violent and fueled by heroin. I mean, he routinely beat her, but she also routinely beat him. This was not a relationship where somebody was the victim. This was mutual destructive behavior, I would say, yeah?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, they were just two flames feeding off each other, burning brighter and hotter, and inevitably they burned out fast. And Nancy was polarizing, even in a scene that embraced outsiders. They even had a nickname for her, which is a bummer.
I hate it.
Yeah, nauseating Nancy, that's terrible. It sounds like a garbage pail kid. It was given to her. I get it.
It's I get it. It's punk in the 70s, and they all had this like Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious, but still, they gave it to her because they really didn't like her.
Exactly. Like Nasty Nancy would have been better.
Naughty
Nancy. Yeah, literally anything but nauseating. They just thought she had an abrasive personality, and she caused a lot of chaos in social situations. She had a reputation for being loud, confrontational, and just really difficult to get along with. Many people in the punk community, including some of Sid Vicious's bandmates in the Sex Pistols, disliked her intensely. Her heavy drug use combined with her mental health issues made her unpredictable and prone to violent outbursts, which alienated her from so many people around her. So they met, and for Sid, Nancy just wasn't his girlfriend. She was also kind of his manager, although let's be real. I mean, managing Sid Vicious at this point was like trying to manage a hurricane.
Didn't he at some point also try to have like a solo career? I think My Way. Didn't he sing My Way? Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't.
I remember.
Yeah. By 1978, things had started to unravel fast. The Sex Pistols had imploded on a disastrous U.S. tour, and Sid and Nancy moved into the Chelsea Hotel in New York. So, as we've told you, the Chelsea's always been this haven for artists, musicians, and eccentrics. It was a place where creativity thrived, but so did dysfunction. And for Sid and Nancy, the hotel became less of a creative haven and more of a place where they could spiral deeper into addiction. Their room, Room 100, became infamous as their relationship took an even darker turn. They were constantly fighting and heavily using drugs. If the walls of the Chelsea could talk, their room would probably scream. And then on October 12th, 1978, it all came to a head. Nancy Spungen was found dead in their room, on the bathroom floor, stabbed in the abdomen. She was just 20 years old. Sid was the only other person in the room at the time. He had actually woken up and found her and called for help. He was promptly arrested and charged with her murder, but here's the thing. Sid's account of that night was hazy at best. He claimed he didn't remember what happened because he was high on heroin as usual, and the story gets murky from here. There were rumors that Sid had confessed to the crime, then later retracted it. Others believe someone else might have been involved, but no one can say for sure. What is certain is that Nancy's death marked the end of their destructive love affair. Sid didn't spend much time behind bars, though. He was released on bail, and just a few months later, on February 2nd, 1979, Sid Vicious died of a heroin overdose. Now, both of them were gone, leaving behind a trail of questions and a legacy defined by chaos, addiction, and tragedy.
Yeah, and of course their whirlwind relationship and the horrible, tragic death would be romanticized for decades to come. It's like they are some punk version of Romeo and Juliet for many people.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not forget, at the heart of their story was something that is not glamorous and romantic at all. It was trauma and addiction, mental health issues, and caused by all that violence.
Yeah. And the thing that's so interesting, I think, is how so many people do think it's like a Romeo and Juliet, but those people also don't realize Romeo and Juliet isn't a love story. It's
neither. It's horrible. It's tragic.
Terrible. It's a bunch of teenagers killing themselves.
Yeah.
The thing that I thought was interesting is I had always before we did this episode, I always thought that Sid stabbed Nancy and that was it, case closed, and then Sid overdosed. But when we looked into it, I found out that a lot of people, including Nancy's family, or at least certain members, they don't necessarily think that Sid killed her. They think it's possible that either someone else came in and had done it because a lot of people just, as we talked about, really disliked her and had legitimate beef with her for all manner of reasons.
First of all, that, and also because they obviously had a lot of connection to the drug scene and dealers. And I think Nancy was also known for ripping off dealers or people. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Which is never a good idea.
Never. No. The other thing they think is possible is that the two of them actually had a suicide pact, and that the reason Sid doesn't remember anything that night is because he had actually taken so much that he didn't think he was going to live, and that Nancy had stabbed herself. And then he woke up, realized he was alive, but had basically just survived an overdose and didn't know what was going on. And so it just took him a while to complete his side of the pact. But I don't know. It's hard to know.
I think all of it is possible. There's not one thing where I would say I think that's what happened.
Agreed. I'd be really curious to hear what our listeners think happened, because there are probably some people deep into this case with big thoughts.
Yeah. Also, there's a really good movie that I can highly recommend. Is Sid and Nancy, starring Gary Oldman. Yeah, very young Gary Oldman as Sid Vicious. Really good.
Was that the one where parts of it were filmed at the Chelsea?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah. All right. So, obviously there's been more, but now it's time to talk about who's haunting the Chelsea. I mean, it would probably be easier to say who isn't haunting the Chelsea.
True.
But probably the best ghost story, the most famous ghost story about the Chelsea Hotel comes from the actor Michael Imperioli. He was famously in the show The Sopranos. He appeared on a TV show called Celebrity Ghost Stories, and this was back in 2010. I loved that show. I think I've seen almost all of them. And in it, Michael goes on the show and talks about how before he became famous, he was living at the Chelsea Hotel on the 8th floor, because he'd broken up with his girlfriend, who he shared a place with, so he needed to, get out. So he moved into the Chelsea for a bit. Other residents of the hotel would ask him if he had met Mary yet. And they'd say stuff like, "Oh, have you met Mary yet?" And he was like, "Who is this Mary?" There was a lady who threw orgies every month living at the hotel at that time. There were some super eccentric visual artists. There was a pornographer that lived downstairs from him. So he was just thinking that Mary must be this pretty wild character, right? And "Oh, have you met her yet?" But they were all like, "You'll know if you meet her." He didn't really think much of it. A month or so later, so this would be one night in 1996, Michael takes the elevator up to the 8th floor to go to his room. And as the elevator doors open, he thinks, gosh, it looks a bit dimmer than usual in the hallway. He's walking to his room when he hears the sound of someone crying, and it's coming from behind him. It's a really big, long hotel. We'll post pictures of it, but it's a huge hotel, and so it's got these very, very long hallways. So he turns around to see who's crying and starts to walk down toward the end of the hallway, where he can see this woman who is sort of crumpled on the ground, huddled in the corner, and she's crying and sobbing and wearing this very long black dress that looked very out of the period, long sleeves, high neck, all this kind of stuff. But he assumes it's just someone with eccentric style because, it's the Chelsea.
Yeah.
So she's crying her heart out, like she's absolutely devastated. But he says the thing that was really strange is that the sound of the crying didn't sound like it was coming from the woman in front of him. It sounded like it was echoing through the hall. And so Michael calls out, "Are you okay?" And all of a sudden there's a pop behind him and a light bulb blows out. And so he turns to look at it. And when he turns back, the woman was gone.
Goosebumps.
Yeah. About a week later, he runs into some of the residents who had asked him about Mary, and he says he thinks maybe he has met Mary. And one of them explains that Mary was a young woman from Buffalo, New York. She was married, and she'd been staying at the hotel waiting for her husband and his brother to return from England, where they'd sailed to receive an inheritance. So she decided that rather than waiting at home, she missed him so much, she was going to go to the Chelsea pier and surprise him at the dock. So she would be there when he disembarked the RMS Titanic. She was staying at the Chelsea when she learned her husband had perished, and she returned to her room and hanged herself there. When Michael learned this, he felt like he had seen her last moments replayed, collapsing by the door before going into her room to end her life. And he didn't feel comfortable in the hotel anymore and checked out forever a week later. He says today he still can't hear about the Titanic or about the Chelsea Hotel without thinking about Mary, and it still makes his hair stand on end. We will, of course, link you to the YouTube video of his story. I think that's the creepiest.
That's a really good ghost story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's not the only one. Other guests over the years have reportedly said that the place is thick with ghosts. They've seen them in the halls and in their rooms. They report that during construction it was particularly bad. And interestingly, we didn't find any stories of Dylan Thomas haunting the hotel, even though that question was the one that prompted this episode.
That's right.
If you want to stay in room 100, you can't. After the death of Sid and Nancy, the management reconfigured the suites and there is no more room 100, and that space is now divided up and is basically part of other rooms. So you can choose, do you want to stay in the room that has the former bathroom of room 100, for example, or the main living room of room 100, but you can't stay in room 100. There's a piece in Chelsea Community News in which scholar, writer, and part-time resident Amanda Chemchi, who did her Yale thesis on the Chelsea and is now working on a book called The Ghosts of the Chelsea Hotel. Shouldn't it be the Hotel Chelsea then?
I mean,
come on.
I do feel like it should be, but here we are.
And she says, quote, "I look at ghosts as a metaphor for the many people who lived and died in the building over its 100-year-plus history. I also look at ghosts as a metaphor for trauma and talk about trauma embedded in the architecture of the building," end quote. Would you stay at the hotel?
Yeah, I would not only stay, I want to check out the 8th floor to see if we can find Mary. Will you come with me?
Oh, it's been on my bucket list for, I don't know, decades.
Yes,
decades.
We're going to make it happen.
Even before I started to believe in ghosts. We need to. We have to. We need to.
It's a cool hotel, too. Like, we talked about it a little bit, but, like, it's one of these hotels, I think, kind of like the Hotel del Coronado, where none of the rooms are identical. It's not like going to a modern hotel, you know? It's been carved up in so many different ways that all of the rooms are really, truly are unique. So, yeah.
The bar is also really nice.
Yeah, the El Quixote and in the lobby or the ground floor. There's like a Spanish restaurant and bar that looks amazing.
All right, I think let's end this episode with, because there's so much history and stories and people who've been there. It's like we could do a whole podcast about it.
Right.
But let's leave you with some fun facts.
We're going to pebble you.
Arthur Miller, he lived at the hotel for 6 years after he divorced Marilyn Monroe, and he once wrote about the Chelsea, saying in part, quote, "This hotel does not belong to America. There are no vacuum cleaners, no rules. Shame," end quote.
I love that. It's like my house.
He would then not like your house, apparently.
No. Leonard Cohen and Janis Joplin carried on an affair after meeting in the elevator of the Chelsea Hotel. 2 of Cohen's songs are about the Chelsea, and in fact his song Chelsea Hotel No. 2 is an ode to Janis Joplin, who I think propositioned him.
Leonard Cohen was such a lover of many great women,
yes.
But all of them spoke so fondly of him, and he was not like this kind of player guy. I think he just really loved women.
He did. And that's okay. You know, it's one of these things where somebody said to me once, like, well, women don't like it if men have. And it's like, no, that's not true. It's all about how you treat people. There are plenty of examples of men and women in history who never committed to anyone and just had lots of wonderful lovers who all spoke highly of them. It's not for everyone, but hey.
Another fact, Arthur C. Clarke wrote 2001 A Space Odyssey while staying there. Also, other authors who stayed there include Allen Ginsberg, Thomas Wolfe, Tom Waits, Rufus Wainwright, and Tennessee Williams, among others.
This is one of my favorites. One time while walking into the hotel, Jimi Hendrix was confused for a bellhop by an old lady, but he just went ahead and carried her bags up for her anyway. He was like, yeah, it's fine.
That's like one of my favorite Brian Wilson stories. I think it was Bono from U2 at some award ceremony, and Brian Wilson was there, and he went up to greet Brian Wilson to be introduced, and Brian Wilson thought Bono was a waiter and asked him for a Diet Coke, and I think Bono even brought him a Diet Coke.
I love that. That's amazing.
If Brian Wilson asks you for a Diet Coke, you bring him a Diet Coke.
Of course you do.
Before Scientology could afford its own fancy buildings, L. Ron Hubbard, he used the Chelsea as a meeting spot, well, because he lived there in the 1950s for a little bit, and he also worked on his absolutely fantastic writing there.
When O. Henry stayed there, he used a fake name because he was hiding from creditors. But when Samuel Clemens was staying there, he was known as Mark Twain by everybody.
Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, they both lived at the Chelsea, as did the painter Jackson Pollock, pop artist and filmmaker Andy Warhol, and we mentioned it before, his factory performers. They also shot Chelsea Girls in 1966 there, telling the story of some of Warhol's superstars who lived at the hotel. I think the famous it girl Edie Sedgwick even set a room on fire at the Chelsea.
Yes.
Or is this just a rumor?
Nope, she did. She set her room on fire. She also wanted her part in Chelsea Girls to be cut from the film.
Yeah, I remember reading that. True. Yeah.
Bob Dylan wrote 2 songs while living there, and Joni Mitchell's Chelsea Morning is about the Chelsea.
And poet turned rocker Patti Smith and acclaimed photographer Robert Mapplethorne came of age together as artists in a complex relationship that Smith chronicled in her book Just Kids, that was published in 2010. The book also provides a vivid portrait of Stanley Bart, who managed Chelsea from the early 1970s to 2007. Can you imagine the stories he has to tell?
Oh, yeah.
He's the one we mentioned would take payment in form of artwork or whatever, and that then graced the halls of the hotel and the stairway in particular. I think there exist photos of the 1970s with all this great art in the stairways.
amazing and
crazy,
priceless. Yeah. And in more recent decades, Chelsea residents have included Madonna. She lived there in the early 80s, but she went back to room 822 to shoot her photography book called Sex in 1992, which gave my mother
Can you remember how shocking that was when that came out?
Oh, yeah. My mother, my Irish Catholic mother, I wasn't allowed to own Madonna cassette tapes anyway, but this was like proof. Ay, ay, ay. So what story about the Chelsea? We didn't include everything. There are so many stories about the Chelsea. What did we forget? What was your favorite? I thought it was, for me, the most interesting thing I took away from this was learning that Dylan Thomas didn't just die because he drank too much whiskey. Yeah. He was killed by medical incompetence. I'm glad we did this episode because I had no idea.
It's so fascinating. It's just as fascinating as the Chateau Marmont.
Absolutely.
Do you have something good?
Yeah, I do have something good, actually. So right now it's Thursday, October 10th. And it looks at the moment, preliminary reports coming in, is that this most recent Hurricane Milton, which was predicted to be potentially one of the worst Category 5 largest on record, it looks like, at least in Tampa, instead of the storm surging in, the hurricane sucked the water out. And so, again, preliminary information is looking like it could have been a whole lot worse than it was. And I'm very grateful for that because so many people are still trying to get themselves together after Hurricane Helene. It's just amazing to me how terrifying these storms are really starting to get. We were watching last night, especially because my in-laws are there and my birth mom's down there. And we were watching all of these tornadoes popping up. So, you're watching the eye of the storm, but like miles away in South Florida, nowhere near the hurricane, it's like the day after tomorrow is starting to happen. These disaster movies that I love so much, I just don't want them to feel so accurate these days. That's all. But yeah, I'm very grateful that people, it looks like it could have been a whole lot worse. And I'm very grateful for the response that's been happening so far. Just the government response and the independent charity responses seem to be very timely. And I just hope that continues. And we're just sending our love to everybody in the path of these storms or any storms. It's really hard for us to really talk about storms on a regular basis because we live on different sides of the world and we would basically just end up talking about what's going on weather-wise kind of nonstop. But this has been a particularly rough week for the southeastern United States, and we're just thinking of all of you.
Yeah, definitely. I'll join you in that as my something good. And I kept following it first because I've been in a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico with Wilma, so I know how scary and how horrible that is. And I've been following the news to see what's going on. So I would be very happy if it wouldn't turn out to be as bad as predicted. Also, I'm very thankful for all the people who took in animals they found outside. I just saw a report of police finding a dog that was tied to a post left behind by their owners.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I really hope everybody gets through it okay.
That's it. Stay safe this hurricane season, everybody.
Stay safe. Yeah.
All right.
Please tell your pets we said hi. Hug them, cuddle them, give them treats. Take them to the vet. Be kind to them. Be kind to your fellow human being. And the most important part of it all, be kind to yourself.
And just remember that if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.